Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations in each one of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, for you are our rock and you are our Redeemer. Amen. Last week, I preached about the importance of welcome. Welcome is a fundamental attitude of God toward us and of us toward one another as we live out our calling to follow Jesus. This week has me thinking about the opposite of welcome. What word comes to mind if you think of the opposite of welcome? I came up with a few: hostility, exclusion, ignoring, and here's one that's not really a word: closed offness. I don't know if we have the right word for the opposite of welcome, but I think we know it when we see it. And we certainly hear it in the gospel lesson for this week, in this parable that Jesus tells. This parable is about a beggar named Lazarus who's sitting at the entrance of a rich man's home. The beggar has been overlooked by the rich man, who clearly has enough to share. But importantly, the beggar is also known by the rich man. This isn't some faceless, nameless person who is out there in the world in need. This is someone who lives at the gate of the rich man. The rich man even uses his name, Lazarus. This is the only time in any of the parables that Jesus tells that one of the people is given a name. His identity is important for the story and important, we think, for God. This is one in a string of parables and lessons told by Jesus to the Pharisees, who, according to Luke, were lovers of money. Earlier in this chapter in Luke, Jesus told the Pharisees that they could not serve God and wealth, and their response was to ridicule him. For Jesus' audience here, worldly wealth was a sign of God's favor, God's blessing. Wealth and good religiosity went hand in hand. No conflict there. And here comes Jesus over and over again, challenging this assumption. And over again, the people that Jesus is talking to aren't hearing it, aren't hearing what Jesus is trying to teach them. And so he tells them this parable, the last one he will tell, that is so clearly about the relationship of wealth and discipleship. And I have to say that when I read this text, I get a very obvious message. And I want to know if you do too. So I'm going to do a pair and share. I didn't do it last week, but I'm doing it today. Turn to somebody. It can be someone you know, it can be someone you don't know, but look around and make sure that everybody has someone to talk to before you start talking. And look at this lesson, and I just want you to come up with your partner with the point of this. What is Jesus' point? In one sentence, what's he trying to teach us? So first, make sure that you've got someone to talk to and that everybody does. No one gets left out here. That's kind of the point. And then what do you think is the point of this lesson? What do you think Jesus is trying to teach us? Oh, Norm, you're sitting here alone. What's he trying to teach you, Norm?
Care and love.
Care and love, okay. All right. Yes. I was just about left poor Norm up here all alone without anyone to talk to. Did everybody have a chance to come up with at least something? Okay, now here's the thing. I'm not going to ask you each what you talked about, but I can pretty much guarantee that you didn't all come up with the same message. That what seems extremely obvious to me is not the same thing that seems extremely obvious to you. To me, I cannot help but read this, and I've read this, hundreds of times in my life, and feel just immediately challenged in my soul to ask myself, what are you doing for those who have less than you have? But that's not the message that everyone gets. And especially if you're somebody who feels as if you don't have enough money in your life, you're going to hear this very differently. If I lined us up on a trajectory here, rich men over there, Lazarus is over there, everybody line up, we'd be at different places along that, but almost certainly nobody would be at either extreme, because none of us are the caricatures that Jesus is using in this parable. Some people, those who tend to be on the poorer side of the scale, hear in this gospel amazing good news that when life has been so hard, this side of death, there is something to hope for on the other side. People who feel as if the point of our life is to share and to care don't feel the challenge that I feel. They feel an incredible gratitude that they have been able to share and care. They're probably a little bit better at giving than I am. We hear this differently depending on who we are and where we are. And I don't think we can say that God is just trying to teach us one thing in this parable or in any others. But a few things are common. One is that we do live in a world where wealth is synonymous with success. As the Pharisees believed that wealth was synonymous with God's affection and favor, I am hard-pressed to find many people who don't think that they would like themselves to be a little wealthier, their children to have enough to be comfortable. We believe that somehow wealth is a good thing. And this turns that upside down. It really does. It turns our relationship with money on its head. And Jesus has been doing this throughout the Gospel of Luke. The message of Jesus in Luke is consistently directed not about the poor, but to the poor. I have come to bring good news to the poor. Blessed are the poor. One thing I have noticed about church in general is that we tend to assume that we are wealthy. And then we talk about the poor as if they are some other people. But if we look at the world, we know that if you're going to split people into rich and poor, far more people fall into the category of poor. And I wonder what it would be like to be a church of the poor, to think of ourselves as the poor. How would that change the way we live out the gospel? While many of us focus on the rich man because it is true that Jesus is telling the story to the Pharisees about the rich man, he's also saying something about the plight of Lazarus and what it is to be Lazarus. Who would you rather be in this story? Who would you rather be? I immediately say, I'd totally rather be the rich man, right? But I think Jesus is saying, look to the Lazaruses. They have something that you who want to be the rich man don't have. Now, I don't think this is a story about what actually happens after we die. Not at all. I think this is a story for the living, and it's a story that Jesus tells us here and now because Jesus wants us to know something about how to follow him. What kind of gospel is ours to claim and ours to share? And I find that even if I think there is an obvious message in here, which is to notice those who are at the gate, which is to pay attention and show compassion to people that I would like to step over, it's far easier said than done. I went bowling last week. Our Bishop Leila Ortiz, decided that all the pastors needed to have some fun together and to do some bonding. So she invited us all bowling. And she was actually right. It was fun. And we did have a good time together. Now, some of you might not know the game of bowling at all. There's some pins at the end of the lane, and you have to throw a ball down and try to knock over the 10 pins, and you get 2 chances each turn to do it. So you roll the ball, try to knock down 10 pins, and then you roll it again. And usually what happens, at least if you're me, is that either you knock down 0 pins the first time, or you just knock down a couple of them. And then there's 7 more you have to get the second time. I'm telling you all this because the bowling alley where we went, every time you had a second turn, would put up on the TV the pins, what they looked like, and show you where you were supposed to put the ball. Put a little arrow, like, here's 4 pins, put the arrow there. And it became a joke among us. Because of course we knew where we were supposed to put the ball. That wasn't the problem. The problem was how. How are we to do this? And I find that in this gospel lesson, as in so many, the point isn't to learn what the world would be like with God's kingdom of care and compassion. We can imagine it, right? There's not a Lazarus in God's kingdom. There is nobody begging at the gate. There is no gate. The harder thing is how. And Jesus doesn't in this text say that much, but he does say something that I think is really important for us to absorb. Lutherans don't like to preach on how. We don't like to preach on should. We don't think that the gospel ever tells us what we should do. We think it tells us what God has done. But I'm going to break that mold today, and I'm going to tell you some of the shoulds or some of the cues to how we can live the point of this lesson. The first is to notice the various gates in your life, because you have them. You step in and out of situations where some people have less and some people have more all the time. Sometimes it is material wealth, sometimes it's spiritual wealth. Before you judge anybody for being on whatever side of the gate they're on, take some time and notice what gates you find yourself at. And then stay there for just a minute. The gate is an incredibly unpleasant place to be. How many of you have been driving down the road in your car and seen somebody hold up a sign that says they don't have anything? I would bet almost everybody. This is the question I think I've received more than any other question as a pastor. What am I supposed to do in that moment? It is a moment where we recognize that there is something really off in the world. There are haves and have-nots, and we're confronted by that person. At the very least, notice when that happens and ask yourself, what is it that I reasonably could do, recognizing that this is a concern not just back then, but also now. And in that moment, pray. When you don't know what to do, prayer is always a great option. So, be at the gate. Number 2, be generous. Be generous how you can be generous. Generosity is the superpower God gives us to break down these chasms that exist between us, to bridge relationships and create community. And you are never too poor to be generous. You are never too poor to be generous. Generosity isn't just money, it is time, it's forgiveness, it's an openness of heart, it's an attitude that goes around the world saying, I can give love, and then figuring out what that looks like. So give it where you can. Give it where you can. If you are rich and you hear this as a challenge, let that challenge work on you. Really, let God work on you. If you're sitting there thinking, am I the rich man? Is there something more I could do? Let God work on you in that. Don't run away from that too fast. But also don't hear it as an eternal condemnation on your soul. This is not the sum total of the gospel. And if you are poor and you hear this as good news, let the dignity that God gives you in this gospel work on you too. And keep on demanding from the world the healing and the wholeness that you deserve. Finally, recognize in a most basic way that our futures are wrapped up in each other, that the chasm that Jesus describes at the end of the gospel message does not exist on earth, not really, and that there is a way that we can bridge these deep divides between us, rich and poor, and all the other divides that exist, and that that is the work of God in Jesus through the church. These are some of the ways that this gospel text points to us, helps us see how is it that we are to live. But you'll come up with more. That's one of the great things about the parables. So my final piece of advice is talk about this all week long, wherever you are. Notice and talk about the Lazaruses at the gate. Question what it is that we are supposed to be doing as followers in Jesus. Don't hear this as something that's stopping you from action or love, because that's never the gospel either. The gospel always frees us because we are loved in service to love one another. Thanks be to God. Amen.